Hi guys, my name is Genaro Fuentes and my partner is Alec Miranda, and our project is on rejecting modernity and embracing monkey. Now, what this means is rejecting what our understanding of modernity is, and that is the fact that modernity is not implicitly a time frame, but it is when a culture exhibits a certain behavior that shows that it its usage of technology was above or is where we expect technology to be. But our own subjectivity of what modernity is should not lie in necessarily when and what the technology is, but rather for how that technology relates to their culture, and not just their own culture itself, but the technologies and culture of others in that same time frame, in that same time period. Our main article showed us that of different tools that were found in an ancient cave that reflected um, instruments that were far more advanced than was expected of it. These tools were um, were thought to be present over 75,000 years ago and thought to disappear 60,000 years ago. And this cave itself is attributed to the San hunter-gatherer culture, but that culture did not appear until 20,000 years ago. Now, what this shows us is that cultural relativism um, could be due to the surroundings of that cave and not just the culture that was found in that cave. In a different article, we found other instruments in a cave in southern Africa that were attributed to the Middle Stone Ages, which is around 45,000 BC. Now, these artifacts are not necessarily what you'd expect from that time period, given that these are sharpened objects made through scraping, and this attribute is shows us that that the culture that was using these technologies were in fact exhibiting modern behavior at a time at a in a time frame that was not at all what you'd expect from them. How this artifact Most artifacts in this cave were found recently. However, some artifacts were reassessed for their from past studies to see if they matched the present artifacts that were found recently. And and based on this reappraisal, it was found that in fact that the former artifacts did in fact match the modern ones, the more recent ones found. However, um, earlier studies showed that the methods of handling these artifacts actually made them less um, less primitive than how they were found initially, and given that the way they were treated, their authenticity wasn't kept intact. So based on these studies, we see that certain cultures can exhibit modern technologies and behaviors with their instruments, but it should be noted that if these cultures disappear, then they take their technologies with them and the knowledge of handling, producing, and recreating these technologies.
Okay, so I'm going to be looking at some of the different stone tools and bone tools that were used by different groups of people, especially the Sand Bushmen, and especially over different time periods. So this first article um, looked at these arrow forms as well as bows. So the earliest bow they found was 15,000 years ago. They had they talked about in South Africa. Um, they used radiocarbon dating to find that they found these prehistoric arrow forms which were dated between 7,000 and 3,000 BC. And then they also looked at Central Africa, which also looked at different arrow forms, and that was dated back from 16,000 to 15,000 BC. Eventually, they did transition from these bone and stone tools to metal or iron later on. And I just have these figures here that kind of display the arrows that they had. So figure 1, you can see the bone pointed arrow assembled ready for use, as well as the components, the component parts, an arrow of the arrow with a bone point, a reed collar, and a link shaft. It shows the reverse position for the poison arrows when they're not in use. It also mentioned that some sand arrows use a single feather, as well as the head of the arrow is wooden tipped, and they called it the bird arrow. So these also bone-headed arrows with quill barbs, but that didn't have link shafts, are described also from the Kalahari by Shapera in the article. These appear to be identical with one of a number collected from the Bushmen in the Eastern Cape. And then they also mentioned that they use different plants or different materials as adhesives to put the arrowheads with the shafts. Like, so in northern Zambia, they used a plant called Gardenia imperialis. In Malawi, they used a species called Diplorohychnus mosambicensis, and they had different properties, but they were all adhesives. Next slide. Next slide. Then another article I found looked at bone tools that were found between 1 to 2 million years ago, and it compares South African tools to Eastern African ones. And they also looked at a species specifically to compare the use of the tools and to see if the species was the same between the two. So the 4 sites were Old Dubai in East Africa, and then in South Africa they had 3 sites. So the South and East African bone tools are quite different. With the South African tools, they had a number of distinct characters formed through utilization, whereas the Eastern African tools are flake tools that in some cases mirror stone tool production. So they're clearly very different in that aspect. The South African tools have been interpreted as being used for digging into homogeneous grained soil to access high quality food resources, or as varied multi-purpose tools. So in figure 1, you can see the top 3, A through C, are definitive. They're different types of bone tools, while the bottom 2 are pseudo tools. They're used a little bit differently. And then figure 2 shows newly identified bone tools on the left, and then those on the right are from Kromdraai, which is one of the sites in South Africa. And this actually showed striations and rounded tips, showing that they've been used. Yeah, and there remains no direct correlation between the occurrence of these bone or stone tools and a particular species found at the different sites. The place of these bone tools within the South African archaeological record show that they appear to be a consistent part of the South African record for around 1 million years or so, between 2.3 and 0.8 million years ago. Next slide. So this one looked at the use of stone tools that were found on animal tissues, and this dates back way further to around 3.39 million years ago. So the discovery extends by approximately 800,000 years for these stone tools, and it showed that they needed these stone tools to consume hoofed animals, also called ungulates. The earliest demonstration of stone tool production, according to this article, um, they said was after 2.6 million years ago at several different locations in Ethiopia and Kenya. So that's one thing that's been um, heavily discussed and like very controversial between all these different articles, is they don't really know when these tools were actually begin to be used, and it varied definitely um, by by the group using them. So you could see some of these figures show that the rib fragments of the animals, they have a different marks. Some of them have perpendicular marks, microstriations, and some scraping, cutting, all different marks that show that these were a stone tool cut marks. Um, and they also mentioned that sometimes the bone tools were used instead of stone tools because they didn't have the access to the raw materials needed for those stone tools. And then this species, af, afarensis. So the only hominin species present here 3.39 million years ago to which we can associate this tool use to is that species. And whether the species also produce stone tools remains to be demonstrated, but the evidence from figure 1 finds that it may fit with the view that stone tool production predates the earliest known archaeological sites. And an early phase of stone tool use in hominin evolution will show us, and it will greatly improve our understanding of how this type of behavior originated and how it eventually developed into later stone tool production technologies and a more modern culture. Next slide.
So our presentation shows you that modernity was expressed at different points in time by different cultures based on availability and their resources, requirements in their environments to survive, or simply acquisition of tools that fit their needs. Thank you.